I grip my fork a little tighter than I mean to, and I set it down before Renee notices. The dining room at Callahan's Diner is closed for the night, chairs still stacked on two of the back tables. But ours is set like a holiday. White tablecloth, the kind we only pull out for Easter. The good plates my grandmother used for church suppers. The ones with the thin gold rim that Renee always swore she'd inherit someday. A bottle of sparkling cider stands open in the middle of the table, because none of us really drink. But Renee wanted something that would pop when she poured it, something that would sound like a celebration even if it didn't feel like one to me. Marcus and the kids arrived 20 minutes before I did, and by the time I walked in, the two boys were already upstairs stomping around what used to be a storage room above the kitchen, measuring walls with a tape measure Renee had brought along for exactly that purpose. She'd printed out paint swatches for an apartment that, as far as I knew, still legally belonged to our father, and taped them to the refrigerator in the diner kitchen, where Miriam would have to look at them every morning until somebody took them down. "So, we're doing this," she says, filling my glass without asking if I wanted any. "Marcus and the kids can be moved into the apartment upstairs by the weekend. Dad already said it's fine." She says it the way you'd announce a vacation. Easy. Final. Like the decision belongs entirely to her and the rest of us are just here to hear it read out loud. Across the table, my father nods along, but his eyes are somewhere else, somewhere just behind Renee's shoulder, the way they get when he's smiling at a conversation he isn't quite following anymore. I've learned to read that look over the last 8 months. Most people would miss it entirely. I don't, because reading exactly that look is part of what I do for a living, 5 days a week for people who are not my father. Renee lifts her glass. "To new beginnings," she says, and Marcus lifts his too because that's what you do, and my father lifts his because everyone else did. And for one long moment I'm the only person at this table not drinking to a plan I never agreed to and never once heard discussed out loud until tonight. "Why do you look like that?" Renee asks, laughing a little, glancing at Dad like she needs him to back her up. "This is good news, Nora. The restaurant stays in the family. I finally get to do something real with my life instead of bouncing between temp jobs. Everybody wins here." I set my glass down instead of drinking from it. My father's spoon clinks softly against his water glass. An old habit. The sound he's made at every family dinner since I was small enough to sit on a phone book to reach the table. "Actually, I say," and my voice comes out steadier than I expect it to, "that's not going to work the way you think it does." Renee's smile doesn't move yet. "What's that supposed to mean?" "The deed you had Dad sign 2 months ago. It's frozen. Has been since last Tuesday." For a second, nobody says anything. Renee's cider glass stops halfway to her mouth, hanging there like she's forgotten what her own hand is doing. Marcus looks at her, then at me, then back at her. The way you look between two people during an argument you didn't know you'd walked into. "Frozen," Renee repeats. What does that even mean? I could tell her everything right now. I have the notice folded into my jacket pocket, where it's been sitting for 6 days, waiting for a moment I wasn't entirely sure I'd ever choose to use it in. But I don't reach for it yet. Some things you have to walk backward into before anyone will actually believe them. And this family has never once believed me on the first try. "Show me," Renee says, holding her hand out across the table, palm up, the way she used to when we were kids, and she wanted something of mine handed over on principle rather than out of any actual right to it. "You'll see it," I say, "but you need to understand how we got here first, because I don't think you actually do, and I think that matters more tonight than the paper itself." Renee sits back, arms crossed, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, she doesn't argue. She just waits, the way you wait for bad news you already half suspect is coming. 8 months ago, none of this was anywhere near my radar. I was working my usual rotation at the memory care clinic outside Millbrook, running cognitive screenings on people twice my age. writing careful notes about orientation and recall in charts that never once had my father's name on them. I saw him every Sunday, same as always, and for a long time Sunday looked exactly like it always had. Coffee at the counter of the diner before the breakfast crowd came in. My father wiping down the same 3 feet of countertop out of habit, even though Miriam had already done it an hour earlier. He told me the story about the health inspector from 1991, the one who tried to shut them down over a walk-in cooler that was 2 degrees warm. He told it well, the way he always had, with the same pause before the punchline, the same little laugh at his own joke. The second time he told me that exact story in the same morning. I laughed along and didn't think much of it. People repeat themselves. The third time, 20 minutes later, word for word. I felt something small and cold settle in my stomach, and I didn't say anything about it. Not yet, not to him. My grandparents opened Callahan's Diner in 1968, back when Maple Row was still a dirt road half the year. And my father took it over from them in his late 20s, keeping the same recipes, the same counter stools, the same bell over the door that never got replaced even after 3 separate remodels. My mother worked the register there for 30 years before she passed. 6 years ago now. And I still remember her handwriting in the old ledger book stacked in the back office, neat and slanted, noting every delivery and every slow Tuesday like the diner itself was a member of the family that needed looking after. She used to say the place would still be standing long after all of us were gone, as long as somebody kept it honest. I don't think she meant that as a threat. I think she meant it as a hope. I started noticing other things after that Sunday, small things I would have talked myself out of if I hadn't spent 11 years training myself to notice exactly this pattern in other people's parents. He left a burner on under an empty pan one morning and had no memory of turning it on, insisted the stove had a wiring problem until I checked it myself and found nothing wrong with the wiring. He asked me twice in one visit what day of the week it was. Not making conversation, actually asking, waiting for the answer like it mattered. He mixed up which of his 2 grandsons played baseball and which one played soccer, a thing he had never once gotten wrong in 74 years of being a grandfather who showed up to every game he could. None of it screamed emergency on its own. All of it together kept me awake some nights in a way I didn't want to admit to anyone, including my husband, Dan, who noticed I'd stopped sleeping through the night around then and asked, gently, what was going on in my head. I told him eventually, sitting at our kitchen table with the lights off except the one over the stove, that I thought something was wrong with my father and that nobody else in the family had noticed yet, or maybe they had and just weren't saying it out loud. Dan didn't try to fix it for me. He just asked what I needed, which is a question almost nobody else in my life had asked me in years, and I told him I needed to be sure before I said anything to anyone, because being wrong about your own father's mind is a different kind of mistake than being wrong about almost anything else. Part of why I noticed it all goes back further than 8 months, further than my nursing career even. My father's own mother, my grandmother, spent her last 2 years in a memory care unit 2 towns over, and I was the one who sat with her most weekends while the rest of the family found reasons to visit less and less as she stopped remembering their names. I was 19 then, pre-med, unsure what I wanted to do with any of it. Watching a family not know how to hold a person who was disappearing in front of them, watching the arguments over her house and her savings start before she'd even passed, was most of the reason I chose geriatric nursing in the first place. I told myself, at 22, that I'd know the signs early enough next time to actually do something about them instead of standing in a hallway feeling useless. I didn't expect next time to be my own father, in his own restaurant, with my own sister standing in exactly the spot our family had stood in 15 years earlier. I know what those early signs mean better than most people in this family ever will. Because I spend my working hours watching for exactly this pattern in strangers' parents. Orientation to time. Repetition. Word-finding trouble that shows up as long pauses in the middle of familiar sentences. I carry a mental chart of what mild cognitive changes look like in their earliest, most deniable stage. Back when they're still easy to explain away as a bad night's sleep or a long week, my own father was starting to check almost every box on that chart, and I was the only person standing close enough to see it clearly. I didn't go to Renee first. I went to my father directly, gently, on a quiet Sunday when it was just the two of us at the counter, and asked if he'd be willing to see someone for a checkup. Nothing serious, just to put my mind at ease. He agreed faster than I expected him to. Looking back, I think some part of him already knew, in the way people sometimes know things about their own minds before anyone says the words out loud. Dr. Patricia Hensley runs the cognitive assessment clinic at the regional hospital, about 40 minutes from Millbrook, in a building that smells like every clinical building smells: hand sanitizer and old carpet and something faintly like coffee that's been sitting too long. I paid for the visit myself. $650 out of pocket, because I didn't want it running through the family insurance where Renee would see the claim before I'd had a chance to understand what we were actually dealing with. The assessment took most of an afternoon. My father sat across from Dr. Hensley at a small table, drawing a clock face when she asked him to, copying a simple shape, trying to remember a short list of unrelated words she'd read to him 5 minutes earlier. I sat in the waiting room the whole time, flipping through a magazine I never actually read a single page of, listening to the low murmur of voices through the door and trying to guess what they meant. Dr. Hensley used a screening tool called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. 30 points total, and my father scored in a range she described, carefully, in a voice built for delivering exactly this kind of news, as mild to moderate impairment, not dementia the way people picture it in movies, not a man who's forgotten his own name, but enough that his judgment on any given day could not be counted on to be the same steady judgment he'd had 5 years earlier. Enough that a good morning and a bad morning could look almost identical to a stranger and mean two completely different things about what he was capable of understanding. I told Renee I thought she deserved to know. And honestly, some part of me thought she'd want to know, the same way I had. She waved it off in about 4 seconds flat, barely looking up from her phone. "You're a nurse, Nora," she said. "You see dementia in every person over 60. Dad's fine. He's just getting older. Same as everybody's dad." 1 week later, she moved into his house. Told the whole family it was so she could keep an eye on him. And I remember feeling something close to relief when she said it. Actually relieved. Because for one brief moment I thought that meant someone else would finally be watching the things I'd been watching alone for months. That relief didn't last past the first few weeks. Over the months that followed, my visits started getting shorter. Always for a reason that sounded reasonable enough on its own. Dad's resting. Dad had a rough night. Dad's got a doctor thing this afternoon. Better not to overwhelm him with company right now. I'd call ahead and Renee would answer his phone more often than he did, her voice bright and a little too fast, already steering the conversation before I'd finished my first sentence. At the restaurant, things shifted too in ways the staff noticed before I did. Renee started coming in during hours she'd never worked before in her life, rearranging the schedule without telling the people who'd built their whole routine around the old one, pulling cash from the register for expenses nobody could quite account for later when Miriam asked. My father used to know that register down to the last dollar, could catch a $5 discrepancy from across the kitchen. He stopped checking it around the same time Renee started deciding who got to see him and for how long. I tried twice to say something directly. The first time, at his house on a Sunday, I asked Renee flat out why visits kept getting shorter, and she told me I was being paranoid. That Dad just tired easily now, and I should be grateful someone was finally taking his care seriously instead of showing up once a week and calling it enough. The second time, a month later, I brought it up again and she cried, actual tears. Told me she was doing everything alone while I got to walk away every Sunday afternoon back to my own life, my own husband, my own quiet house. And somehow by the end of that conversation, I was the one apologizing. I remember driving home that second time with my hands shaking on the wheel, not from anger exactly, more from the strange dizziness of being told, calmly and confidently, that the thing I'd watched with my own eyes hadn't happened the way I remembered it happening. Dan met me at the door and didn't ask how it went, just made tea and sat with me while I stopped shaking. "You're not losing your mind," he said at one point, quietly, like he knew that was the exact fear sitting underneath everything else. "I'm not," I told him, and I almost believed it. It was Miriam who finally told me what was actually happening behind those shortened visits. Miriam Okafor has cooked in that kitchen since before I was born. She started working the line for my grandparents back when the diner still had a jukebox in the corner and a menu board you had to change by hand. And she's outlasted 3 remodels, 2 health inspectors, and 1 entire generation of Callahans standing at that grill. She caught me in the parking lot one evening in early spring, well out of earshot of anyone inside, wiping her hands on her apron even though they were already clean, the way people do when they're nervous about what they're about to say. She told me that about 2 months back. A woman she didn't recognize had come to the house, not the diner, the house, carrying a folder of papers for my father to sign. Not a lawyer's office, not a bank branch with a notary on staff. The kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. Miriam said my father had seemed off that day, more off than usual, repeating himself twice in the same breakfast rush, asking at one point where his wife was, forgetting for a moment that my mother had passed years earlier. Renee had told the strange woman, in front of Miriam, that he was just tired, that it happened sometimes, nothing to worry about. I felt something go completely cold in my chest, standing in that parking lot with the evening light going orange behind the power lines. I thanked Miriam, told her not to say a word to Renee, and drove home barely remembering the turns. I didn't sleep that night. Dan sat up with me until almost 2 in the morning while I talked through what it might mean, turning it over from every angle, refusing to let myself land on the worst explanation until I actually knew something for certain. In the morning, before my shift, I drove straight to the county recorder's office instead of to work, and called in late for the first time in 3 years. It took less than 10 minutes to find it. A quitclaim deed, filed 2 months earlier, transferring the entire property at 14 Maple Row, the diner building and the apartment above it, out of my father's name and into Renee's, solely, with no mention of me or anyone else. Signed, notarized, recorded, as far as the county was concerned, sitting there in black and white on official letterhead. It was already done and settled. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time before I did anything else, watching people walk in and out of the courthouse with folders under their arms, wondering how many of them were walking into exactly the kind of morning I'd just had. I called Dan first, not to ask him what to do, but just to say the words out loud to someone who wouldn't immediately try to explain them away. He was quiet on the other end for a moment, and then he asked the only question that mattered. "What does Dad actually want?" he said, "not what does the deed say?" I didn't have an answer yet. I wasn't sure my father did either. Not with any clarity he could hold on to for more than a few minutes at a time. And that uncertainty was exactly the thing the law was built to protect against. I want to say I called Renee right there and confronted her on the spot. I didn't. My whole life, confronting Renee in the moment has gotten me exactly nowhere. because she's always faster with an answer than I am with a question. And somehow I end up the one apologizing by the end of it every single time. This time I decided to do something different. I decided to be slow and quiet and thorough, and let the paperwork do the talking instead of my temper, because paperwork doesn't cry on command, and paperwork doesn't turn a conversation around on you halfway through. I called Grant Ashford, an attorney 2 towns over who specializes in elder law, the kind of practice that deals with guardianships and capacity disputes, and exactly this sort of quiet, paper-based theft. His office was small, a converted house with a wheelchair ramp built onto the porch, and he listened to the whole story without interrupting once, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting I couldn't read upside down. When I finished, he set his pen down and told me the part I needed to hear most. "This is more common than people think," he said. "Families assume a signed, notarized deed is the end of the conversation. It's actually just the start of one. If you can show the person signing it didn't have the capacity the law requires at that exact moment. Timing is everything. That's why your doctor's evaluation from before the deed matters so much. It gives us a clean line, before and after. Instead of an argument about what your father's mind was doing on one specific Tuesday morning nobody else witnessed. I brought him everything. Dr. Hensley's assessment, the date on the deed, what Miriam had told me about the notary coming to the house instead of her own office, which Grant said almost immediately, was one of the first things he'd flag if he saw it in another family's case. Legitimate notaries almost never make house calls for a document this significant, he told me. It's not automatically illegal on its own, but it's exactly the kind of shortcut people take when they don't want witnesses in the room who might ask the wrong question at the wrong moment. While Grant worked quietly, methodically, requesting records and drafting the complaint, the rest of the family started working too, just in a very different direction. My Aunt Diane called first, my father's younger sister, the one who has an opinion on every decision anyone in this family has made since 1980. She'd heard from Renee that I was, in her words, trying to control Dad's business out of jealousy, because he'd apparently started trusting Renee more than he trusted me. "Your father built that place with his own 2 hands, Diane said, her voice sharp through the phone. "The least you could do is let him decide who he trusts with it, instead of dragging lawyers into a family kitchen." I let her talk. I didn't correct her. Correcting Diane has never once, in my entire life, changed Diane's mind about anything. And I'd learned years ago that trying only ever cost me more than staying quiet did. Renee posted something online a few days later, vague enough that she never had to name me directly, something about family members who show up for credit but disappear the moment the real work needs doing. 2 cousins commented with sympathy hearts and a string of exclamation points. My father, if he even saw it, never said a word about it to me. The calls kept coming for weeks. My Uncle Robert, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year, called to ask why I was making Dad's final years so difficult. A cousin I barely remembered from childhood family reunions sent a long message about family loyalty and blood being thicker than paperwork. Even Priya, a nurse I've worked alongside for 6 years, mentioned it over lunch in the break room one day. Carefully, the way you bring up something you already know might be a sore subject. She said she'd heard through a mutual friend that I was fighting my own sister over an inheritance while our father was still alive to watch it happen, and asked, not unkindly, if I was doing okay. If there was anything she could do. I told her the truth, or close enough to it. "It's not about an inheritance," I said. "It's about whether Dad's actual wishes, whatever they turn out to be, ever get asked for at all." Priya was quiet for a second, then said the thing I needed to hear more than I realized. "That sounds like exactly the kind of case you'd flag for someone else's family in about 5 minutes, she said. You're allowed to flag it for your own. I kept working with Grant through all of it, showing up at his office some evenings after my shift instead of going straight home. Going over documents at his conference table while Dan kept dinner warm for me and never once complained about the hours it was costing us. The Tuesday before that dinner, after weeks of preparation, Grant finally filed what's called a quiet title action on my father's behalf, asking the court to formally void the deed on the grounds that my father lacked the capacity to understand what he was signing, and that Renee had exercised what the law calls undue influence over a vulnerable adult. Alongside the complaint, he recorded a notice of Ellis Pendens at the county recorder's office. That single piece of paper is what actually froze things. It doesn't undo the deed by itself, but it clouds the title completely. Nobody can sell that property, refinance it, or borrow against it while the case is pending, because any buyer or lender running a basic title search would see the notice sitting right there in the public record. Plain as day. Renee had no idea any of it existed. That was exactly the point. Grant told me. Quiet and airtight, and already filed before she ever had the chance to react to it. 2 weeks ago, on Grant's advice, I also filed a report with Adult Protective Services, the county agency that investigates exactly this kind of situation: financial exploitation and isolation of an older adult by a caregiver. An investigator named Terry Boyle picked up the case within a few days and told me he'd need to visit my father privately, without Renee present, to conduct a proper welfare check on his own, away from whatever version of events he might otherwise hear first. I gave him Dr. Hensley's contact information, gave him Miriam's number too, and stepped back and let him do his job the way he was trained to do it. I hadn't told Renee any of this. I hadn't told my father either, not directly, not yet, because I needed to know what we were actually dealing with before I said a single word to a man whose memory couldn't always be trusted to hold on to a conversation from one day to the next, and I didn't want to frighten him with half of a story before I had the whole thing in hand. Terry Boyle called me 4 days before that dinner, after his visit with my father. He wouldn't tell me everything. Said his report wasn't finished and he had to be careful about what he shared before it was. But he did say one thing that stayed with me the rest of that week. He said my father had asked him, twice during their conversation, if he was in some kind of trouble, in a voice Terry described as scared rather than confused. That's not typical. Terry told me, confusion looks different from fear. Your father sounded like a man who knew, somewhere underneath everything, that something had gone wrong around him, even if he couldn't have told you what. Which brings us back to that dinner, the good plates, the sparkling cider going flat in the middle of the table. Frozen means the sale can't happen, I tell Renee, finally reaching into my bag and setting the folded notice down on the tablecloth between the cider glasses. There's a lawsuit already filed. This document is recorded at the courthouse, same as your deed was. Only this one says the property is in dispute until a judge decides who actually has the right to it. Renee's face goes through about 4 different expressions in the space of a few seconds. Disbelief sliding into anger, sliding into something closer to fear. You can't do that, she says, her voice climbing. That's insane. Dad signed it. It's legal. I have a piece of paper too, Nora. It's only legal if he understood what he was signing, I say, keeping my voice level the way I would with a frightened patient's family member. And there's a medical record showing he didn't. From before you ever brought that notary to the house. You had him evaluated behind my back, she says, like that's the accusation that's supposed to land hardest. Like it's supposed to make me the villain sitting at this table. I had him evaluated because I'm a nurse and I recognized what was happening to our father. I say, You had a stranger show up at his kitchen table on a morning. Miriam says he couldn't even remember our mother was gone. Marcus has gone very quiet beside her, his fork motionless on his plate. My father is looking between the two of us with the confused, wounded expression he gets when he can tell something important is happening at his own table and can't quite hold on to what it is. His eyes moving from my face to Renee's and back again like he's searching for a version of this conversation that makes sense to him. "This is a family matter," Renee says, her voice rising further now, cracking slightly at the edges. "Nobody outside this family gets to decide what happens to Dad's restaurant. Not some lawyer, not some doctor, not you." That's when someone knocks on the diner's front door. It's well after closing, and through the glass I can see a man in a plain jacket holding a folder under one arm, and behind him, parked at the curb under the streetlight, a car I don't recognize. I already have a fairly good idea who it is before I let him in, because Terry Boyle told me 2 days ago that his preliminary findings were finished and that he'd likely be reaching out to the family soon. I didn't know he'd choose tonight of all nights. I don't think he knew either. Not exactly. He'd apparently been trying to reach Renee for a follow-up interview for 3 days straight, and finally decided to drive out himself rather than leave another message. He introduces himself simply, states his agency and his role, and says he needs a few minutes with Walter Callahan, and with whoever currently holds decision-making authority in this household. Renee tries to answer that question herself, stepping forward, her chin lifted. Terry Boyle, very calmly, without an ounce of theater in his voice, says that's actually the exact question his office has been trying to resolve for the last several weeks, which is a large part of why he's standing here tonight. He doesn't accuse anyone in front of the whole table. That's not how these things work, and I find myself grateful for it, even in the middle of everything. But he does say, plainly, in a tone built for reading exactly this kind of finding out loud, that his office's preliminary review found evidence consistent with isolation and undue influence involving a vulnerable adult, and that the matter has been referred alongside the pending court case for further review. Renee tries to blame the notary. "Denise just did what I asked her to do," she says, and then catches herself half a second too late, realizing exactly what she's just admitted out loud in front of an investigator, an attorney's letter sitting open on the table, and her own father watching her with a face I have never seen him wear before, not once in my whole life. Denise Park is going to have her own problems to answer for later, with the state board that licenses notaries. But that isn't a fight I need to win tonight. Tonight isn't about winning anything at all. It's about my father finally being safe from a decision he never actually made in the first place. The rest of that evening is quiet in a way I didn't expect it to be. Nobody yells after that. Nobody storms out the front door into the parking lot. Marcus takes the kids home early, apologizing to me on his way out in a low voice, telling me he didn't know, and I believe him. My father sits very still, holding his cider glass with both hands, and at one point he looks over at me and asks, in a small voice I haven't heard from him since I was a kid scared of a thunderstorm, whether he did something wrong. "You didn't do anything wrong, Dad," I tell him, reaching across the table to hold his hand, feeling how much thinner it's gotten this past year without my noticing until right now. "Somebody took advantage of a hard moment. That's not the same thing as you making a mistake." It took the court a little over 2 months to rule. Grant said that was actually fast for a contested capacity case, and that plenty of families wait twice as long for a hearing date alone. My father came to the one hearing his testimony was needed for, sitting beside Grant in a suite he hadn't worn since my mother's funeral, and answered the judge's questions slowly, honestly, admitting when he didn't remember something instead of guessing to sound more capable than he was. Dr. Hensley testified for less than 20 minutes. Renee's attorney tried to argue the deed reflected my father's long-standing wishes, and the judge asked, flatly, why those wishes had never once been written down anywhere before that single morning at the kitchen table. The judge voided the deed entirely, calling it void from the moment it was signed, since Dr. Hensley's evaluation from months earlier proved my father lacked the capacity the law requires for a transaction of that size. Denise Park's notary license is currently under review by the state board, and from what Grant's heard through people who track these things, it isn't likely to survive the process. Renee was never criminally charged. Elder financial exploitation cases are notoriously hard to prosecute unless the money trail is completely airtight, and ours wasn't built for that purpose, not from the start. But the property is back in my father's name, clean. And Renee moved out 3 weeks after that dinner, back to her own apartment across town, taking most of her things in 2 trips over a single weekend while I stayed away on purpose. The part I think about most isn't the ruling itself. It's a conversation I had with my father about a month after it was all over, on one of his better days. The kind where his sentences stay straight the whole way through and his eyes stay present in the room with me for the entire visit. He told me he didn't fully remember signing anything, not clearly. He remembered a woman at the kitchen table, remembered feeling like he was supposed to be agreeing to something. Remembered Renee's hand resting on his shoulder the whole time, guiding, though he couldn't have told you toward what exactly. And then he said something I've turned over in my head more times than I can count since that afternoon. I never wanted anyone to own it alone, he said, looking down at his own hands on the table. I wanted it kept. I wanted it fair. That's all I ever wanted from either of you, and nobody thought to ask me. That's the sentence that changed what I understood I was actually fighting for the whole time. Not which daughter ended up with the deed in her name, whether my father's real wishes, the ones underneath all the confusion, ever actually got heard at all, by anyone, including me. Grant helped me set up an irrevocable trust that now holds the diner and the apartment above it, with a professional trustee handling the day-to-day decisions, so no single family member controls the whole thing outright. The way Renee had tried to, and the way, if I'm honest with myself, some part of me might have wanted to as well, in the angrier weeks right after I found that deed. If Renee ever genuinely wants back in, there's a legitimate path for that now, spelled out in writing, with real oversight built into it. Not a folder of papers slid across a kitchen table on somebody's worst morning. My father has an in-home aide 3 days a week now, someone whose only job is looking after him, not looking after a business that happens to have him attached to it as an afterthought. We signed the trust paperwork at Grant's office on a rainy Thursday. My father in the same chair he'd sat in for our very first meeting, reading each page slowly with his glasses pushed down his nose before he'd let himself sign it. Dan came with me that day, sat in the waiting room the whole time doing nothing but being there, and when we walked out, my father shook his hand for a long moment and told him, "Thank you for taking care of his daughter while she was busy taking care of everyone else." It's the first time in months I've seen my father look like he understood, completely and clearly, exactly what had just happened in that room. Renee and I aren't close. Not the way we used to be when we were kids sharing a room at the back of the house above the diner. We had one conversation, stiff and short at my father's request, sitting across from each other at his kitchen table with him watching us both like he was refereeing something he didn't fully understand. It didn't end in forgiveness. It didn't end in another slammed door either. I don't know exactly what happens next between us, and for the first time in a long time, I've stopped trying to script it out in my head ahead of time. I know what happened to my father's restaurant. I know he still walks the register some mornings, slower now, checking the drawer down to the dollar out of a habit that never fully left him. And I know that whatever comes next between me and my sister, that part is finally settled, finally safe, finally his. Some nights, driving home from a late shift, I still think about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. How easily one can dress itself up as the other if nobody's paying close enough attention. I watch for it now in ways I never used to, not just at work with strangers' families, but at home, in my own family, in the small decisions nobody thinks to question out loud until it's almost too late to undo them quietly. My father built something worth protecting, one Sunday breakfast rush at a time, over more than half a century. In the end, protecting it meant listening to what he actually wanted, instead of deciding for him what he should want, and calling that decision love. That's a harder kind of caring than the one that simply moves in and takes over while everyone else is looking the other way. It's the kind that asks first, and waits for the real answer. Even when the real answer takes 8 months and a lawsuit and a stranger knocking on a locked door after closing to finally get heard. I still have my mother's old ledger books, the ones from the back office, boxed up now in my own garage instead of the diner's. I pulled one out not long ago, just to look at her handwriting again, all those careful notes about slow Tuesdays and delivery dates written by a woman who believed the place would still be standing long after everyone who'd loved it was gone, as long as somebody kept it honest. I think about that sentence more than almost anything else these days. Somebody did keep it honest. It just took longer and cost more than any of us expected it to.